you don't need a computer to make music. Creating without a DAW, it can be really great. It really can. And that's what I want to show you today in this video. The process is tedious, but there is a certain sort of peacefulness, I guess you could say, when you're not looking at a computer screen. You're thinking more about the music. You're thinking with your ears more than your eyes. And there's something to be said about that workflow. That's why I think DAWless appeals to so many different people, is that it's really a lot of fun. I could have used a different recorder. I've got other types of multi-track recorders. I've got, for example, the Boss BR1600. I've got a Tascam DP24. I decided to use the Model 12 because at the time that this video was recorded, they're still being sold brand new. And by the way, this video is not sponsored by Tascam or anybody else. I make no money from this video whatsoever. So I've got the Roland JD990, and I have selected a patch and edited it. It is off of the vintage card that you can buy separately for the JD990. And I've got controlling it, the Native Instruments Control S61. But the way it's doing this, it's actually going into my sequencer, which is the Roland MV30. This is a very old sequencer, and just to prove to you that this is old, I'm going to take out the disc, okay? You don't see that very often. The system and the sequence are both stored on this. One thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go through the tedious process of actually recording the sequence to the different tracks, because on these old sequencers, that alone would take an hour for me to film on video. It was very frustrating at times, but I got it done. On track 2 of the MV30, I have recorded a very simple bass line that goes along with the main strings. The strings are recorded on track 9 because this thing is capable of doing recordings on external and internal tracks. And the external track used, the only external track used, is the one going to the JD990, which we have going into the Model 12 on tracks 7 and 8. That track 2 that I mentioned earlier is going into track 2. I'm going to record vocals on track 3, and the drums, which also come out of the MV30, are going on to tracks 5 and 6, because those are stereo drums. So I recorded the drums. This was all done today, but again, it was extremely tedious. I had to go back and change things. I had to tweak the sounds. Fortunately, the MV30 does have fader controls for the different tracks, and those fader controls can be automated. Another important thing I want to mention is that we have the Model 12 MIDI synced to the MV30. So on the first take, whenever I go to record the guitar, which is going to be recorded on track 2 and 3 in stereo, I'm going to have everything else being recorded at the same time. I probably will have to go back and record the guitar a few more times before I'm satisfied with it, but I am going to do the first take in sync with everything else here that's live. And then I'm going to do the vocals last. Vocals are going through the Boss VE20 vocal multi-effects processor. This is an old processor, but I think you could still get them where you can get ones that are very similar to that in the stores. I've taken a factory patch on the VE20 and I've modified it. I've added phantom power to power my AKG C214 microphone, and I've also tweaked a few other settings on this cool pedal here. This is very similar to the type of setup that I actually had in 1995. Instead of having a Model 12, I had a Tascam 488 cassette 8-track multi-track recorder, but it was synced to an actual Roland MV30 just like this. I have some of the discs that I sequenced and synced to that machine way back in 1995, and those discs still work. So maybe I'll do another video on that at some point. All right, so for track 7 and 8, we have the, like I said, the super JD990. Big thick patch there. Then the drums we have on tracks 5 and 6. A simple bass line on track number 2 coming out of the MV30. Whenever I have them all together, they all play in sync and they all record in sync. Next, it's time to record a guitar part. So I picked out a tone that I really like on my Digitech RP360. Now, back in the day, I would have had an ART SGX 2000, but since I don't have that anymore, I'm using a standalone guitar effects, because that's what you need to do whenever you're going DAW-less. Now, you could just record the dry signal of the guitar and add the effects later, but normally, to save time, back in the day, I would always just record the effects to, at that time, tape. Today, digital. All right, we got everything set up, we got everything synced, so I think that we're ready to go ahead and record here. I did have a few mistakes in there. I don't feel like punching in to go over those right now, because that's what you'd have to do. There's no linear editing on the Model 12, so I would have to export the tracks to a DAW to be able to edit those, but since we're going DAW-less today, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and leave the mistakes in, and as I mix down, I'll actually be using the fader controls going up and down to make sure that those bad parts hopefully don't get heard in the final mixdown. If you like this type of content, I'd really appreciate it if you would hit like and or subscribe. All right, now it's time to record the vocals, and to do that I've got my AKG 214 plugged into the Boss VE20 vocal processor, and I can't have the music playing in the background or else we're going to get feedback in the speakers, so for a moment you're only going to hear my voice. We're recording into track number 1, and I do have the low cut switch activated on the Model 12, and I do have some compression rolled in as well. This should give us hopefully a decent recording, so let's give it a try. I'm not a great singer, so please forgive any pitch imperfections that you may detect during this song here. It's just a test song. Whoa! Okay, now it's time to mix down, and I promised you that I was going to show you mastering. This is very, very basic mastering. All of the tracks 1 through 8 that are recorded, instead of going to the main outputs, I've got them going to the sub-outputs. So because they're going to the sub-outputs only, I can use the sub-out on the back of the Model 12 to send the entire mix over to the Symmetrix 425, where I can apply compression, expansion, and limiting. I don't really need to use expansion because there really isn't any noise in this recording. It's very clean. I am using a little bit of compression, a 2-to-1 ratio. It's linked in stereo. And I also have some limiting at the top end to keep it from clipping. I could have applied in this mastering step some EQ from the Model 12 itself. I also could have applied other effects and the built-in effects. But because I printed the effects while I was recording, I really didn't need to do that. But there are a lot more options that you can do if you want to master on the Model 12. Now, mastering on the Model 12 is not something that I really highly recommend that you do. But again, we're just showing you that it is possible at least to do a basic master. This is actually not mastering in the true sense. It's really a mix down, but I'm combining the mixing and the mastering phases into the same stage, the same step, if you will. Normally you would take the mix and you would mix it down, and then you would apply additional effects and EQ to that final 2-track mix. But in this case, we're just going to go ahead and combine those 2 steps, all right? You can see here that I have made some adjustments to the EQ on the Model 12, and I'm recording post EQ onto the master track and on the tracks 9 and 10. So anyway, let's see how this sounds. All right, so I did go back and I had to do this multiple times. I had to adjust mainly this compression to get it just right. I did end up applying a little bit of more EQ here and there, and it was tedious. It really was, but we were able to make a track. I didn't want to show you something that was so basic like you see on other YouTube videos. Like, I know that this is pretty basic, but I purposely added the sequencer into it because I wanted to show people that you could do other types of music. It doesn't have to be just bass, guitar, drums, and vocals. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's usually what you see on these videos where people are recording DAWless. But you could do EDM, you could do hip hop, you can do any kind of style that you want. It just gets more and more difficult the more different types of instruments that you use. A few quick tips for you. Whenever you're recording these tracks, you want to be very careful that the tracks are clean. So you want to make sure that the levels are high enough. If you're using 24-bit recording like I did on this particular song, then you can have the levels of each track fairly low and you're still going to get a clean signal. You just have to turn it up during mixdown. But it's a lot easier if you get a pretty hot signal, not all the way up to 0 decibels, but I usually try to get it when 24-bit recording up to about -12 or -10 decibels on each track. The other thing is I try to keep each instrument within its own space. I try to limit the frequencies of each instrument so that the vocals and the guitar occupy a certain section of the mid-range frequencies. And then you've got the bass, which of course occupies a certain section of the bass frequencies, but making sure that the bass doesn't overlap too much with the bass drum that you find in the rhythm section. And then with keyboards, you just have to kind of play around. It depends on the instrument, obviously, with synthesizers. And this is exactly the way that I would record back in the 1990s with a sequencer. And I have that synchronized, only back then they didn't have MIDI sync on the particular recorder that I had. It had something called tape sync. One of the tracks of the tape would have a special signal recorded onto it that could be transmitted into a time code that kept my sequencer that you saw right there, the MV30, in time. I do want to also mention that if you have an old sequencer and you're thinking about selling it, think very carefully before you do that, because I actually sold my original MV30 years ago. I traded it in for some other gear and for my first DAW, ironically, which was a Cakewalk Pro Audio 7 at the time. And I regretted it very quickly after that. It took me over 20 years to find another working MV30 to put back into my studio, so I don't plan on selling that again. And as I mentioned before, those discs that I recorded Sequence Data 2 back in 1995 still work today. So I can work on those old songs from 1995 today if I want to. DAW-less recording works really, really well when you actually know how to play your instruments. When you can sing all the way through the song, when you can play a keyboard or a guitar all the way through the song, that's what makes it easier, so you don't have to keep doing multiple takes. You can also do something called punch in and punch out, where you use a foot pedal to actually just record a certain segment of a track where you hit the switch with your foot, and then only that part while your foot is held down, depending on what setting you've got, or you click it once to record and click it again to stop recording. But you can fix certain little parts within tracks. And I did used to do that back in the day whenever I had a multi-track tape recorder. But for this particular track, I decided not to do that. Instead, I just muted, and I had to ride the faders. This is something that used to be done back in the day, where you're shifting. I don't have the overhead camera on right now, but you have to shift back and forth at different parts of the song and mute different parts while the song is playing, because you don't have that opportunity to edit linearly like you can in a DAW. So that's another one of those challenges that you may have. Again, I had to do this so many times that showing you all those steps would have made this video take an hour and a half, and I didn't want to do that to you. Now, for most people who want to record DAW-less, what I actually recommend is that you do like I normally do, and that's a hybrid workflow, where you record all of the tracks in something like the Model 12, but then you do export them into your DAW, and then you finish editing and do your mixing and your mastering in your DAW. It just gives you so many more options that, you're really missing out if you don't use the DAW for those final stages. But you don't have to, okay? And that's what this video is about. So thank you for watching, and have a great day.